All right, good morning, everyone. I hope you saw I put up an example paper. I hope that helps. I also put up the final project. It should be a lot of fun. Just imagine Texas secedes, and given what we've learned in the class so far, like what does that look like? Okay, we're going to jump into chapter 13 here. This is going to be elections and electoral systems. This is going to be pretty technical stuff because there are just a seemingly infinite variation of electoral types. So I just want you to get outside the idea that one person comes from every district like in the United States. It's not like that across much of the world. So we'll get into that. Okay. We should talk about a couple of different definitions. First, an electoral system is simply the laws and regulations that govern competition between candidates, parties, whatever it is. Then you have the electoral formula. This is how votes get translated into seats. And this is very important. And this is what we'll talk about a lot in this chapter. We in America, we have what's called first past the post or majoritarian plurality system, right? Like you don't even have to have 50%. You just have to have the most votes in your district and you win, right? Plurality. Um, Whereas in a lot of countries, say, Israel's a good example. Um, they have a single district. The whole nation is one district, and there are 120 legislators that come from that single district, right? And so now you have to talk about what is the electoral formula. And basically, you have to get past a certain percentage, and then you have to garner enough votes to rise within your party to get a legislative seat. And so we'll talk about sort of how that works. But in a lot of countries, they have proportional systems where if, for example, your party gets 20% of the vote, your party gets approximately 20% of the seats in the legislature. Okay, then we have the ballot structure. This is just how the ballot is built. It's built in a lot of different ways in a lot of different countries. Um, in some countries, you don't even see the actual candidate, you just vote for a party. In some countries, you can vote for a particular candidate inside of a party. In some countries, you can vote for multiple uh, multiple different individuals, and then in some countries, you can actually list out a rank order. Like I like this guy number one, and then this woman number two, and then all the way down to say number 12 even. And then they'll do mathematical calculations to determine who won the majority of seats. So it's really interesting the way the ballot is structured as well, because we also have some really interesting social science that says just having your name first on the ballot is important, right? That it can actually affect the outcome of an election. And so in some countries where the list is, say, alphabetical, the A's actually have a little bit of advantage over the Z's. Yeah, really interesting stuff. Finally, we have district magnitude. So this is what we are talking about earlier. In the United States and in the UK and in much of South America, they have single member districts. So they have a district magnitude of one. In every district, one person comes out, right? And then in some places, we'll have, say, 10 different districts and, say, 10 different people come from each district. In Israel, like we was talking about earlier, all 120 members come from a single district. And it is the same in the Netherlands, where all 150 lower house legislators come from a single national district. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the advantages is that you have to have a much more broad-based platform, and you have to have a more national outlook than just simply a local outlook, like is one of the criticisms of the single-member districts like America, because it incentivizes what's called pork barrel politics or corruption or buying votes or just trying to send money to your particular district rather than looking at the country as a whole. And so, yeah, it's an interesting argument. Okay, so basically we have a typology of election types, and they're majoritarian, right? This is like single, plurality. Then you have the proportional system, and you have a mixed system, like in Germany, which we'll talk about. So first, we should talk about elections, right? So we have to take a lot of things into consideration as to what's a democracy. And we talked about that earlier, right? Um, there are suffrage limits. So if you imagine early America, we had property or wealth limits, where you had to have a particularly sized piece of land, and you have to have built an actual homestead on that land to be able to vote, right? And then we could talk about gender. Women weren't allowed to vote until 1920 in America under the U.S. 21st Amendment. In Switzerland, it was 1978 until women could vote. And then in many Islamist states or Muslim states, women still cannot vote. So that's something to consider whether it's a democracy or not, right? Another one is race. So there are countries around the world where particular races or ethnic groups are not allowed to vote. So this was the case in America until, arguably 1964 when the Civil Rights Acts were passed. The indigenous were not allowed to vote in Australia until 1967. And then you had apartheid from, I think it was about 1948 until 1993 when Mandela was released, where blacks could not vote in South Africa, even though they made up the vast majority of the population. Um, we also have age, right? So most countries around the world, it's 18 years old to vote. A very small handful make it either 21 or 16, but the vast majority, like 85, 90%, are 18 years old to vote. Some countries have restrictions on felons, like the United States. There's been a movement to sort of, once you've paid your dues, to restore voting rights to many felons in the United States, but it's still kind of a touchy subject. Most of Europe allows felons to vote, so you can actually vote while you're in prison, right? They say, well, you're still citizens. You still have ideas about policy, especially right, prison policy and justice and things like that. So you deserve the right to vote as well. So that's an interesting argument too. Um, Non-citizens, right? The vast majority of democracies restrict non-citizens from voting. So 41 of the 68 in the paper that they cite here restrict non-voters from voting. The U.S. does not allow any non-citizens to vote in federal elections, but there are some state, local, municipal, etc. elections that non-citizens can actually vote in. So I know San Francisco allows non-citizens to vote in their municipal elections. New York allows non-citizens to vote in the New York City elections, but again, you cannot vote federally. The vast majority of countries also do not allow those who are intellectually disabled to vote. How they define that is touchy, but the vast majority of, at least if you're on sort of the state payroll or something like that because you're intellectually disabled, you will not be allowed to vote. And then some places have geographical restrictions. So a weird one is Washington, D.C. in the United States. Anyone who lives inside Washington, D.C. does not have representation in either the Senate or in the House. Weirdly enough, they have a non-voting member. And so if you live in Washington, D.C., you are taxed without representation, very strangely. Okay, we have a lot of different kinds of voting too, right? So, as we touched on a little bit, you can vote for parties versus individuals. Some countries have multi round voting, like France, where the top two vote getters will have a runoff at the end. Excuse me. Um, we have what's called district magnitude, which we'll have to talk about later, in which we've touched on a little bit here, right? The United States has a district magnitude of 1. Britain has a district magnitude of 1, whereas other countries go all the way up to 120, 150 district magnitude. Some countries have mandatory mandatory representation by women and by minorities. So parties have to list at least 50% women or a percentage of minorities. And then some countries also have what's called compulsory registration and voting, where you're automatically registered to vote when you turn 18, just like you're automatically entered into sort of the draft pool, right? Um, and so there's none of this like trying to restrict people from registering, etc. Most democracies say, a vote is a good thing, right? So, um, and a lot of countries have not only compulsory registration or like mandatory registration, they also have mandatory voting or compulsory voting, where you must vote or you get a small fine, like $15 to $50 or something. And then people who even don't like anyone in the system will come up and cast a non-vote, basically, to say, I am part of the system. I'm doing my sort of, well, I mean, what would you call it? Their social duty, right, to the state, and yet I don't agree with any of these candidates, so I'm just casting a non-vote, basically. And the evidence also finds that most of these places, they don't fine people. Like it's on the books, but it's one of those things like, we're just trying to support you voting. We're not actually going to send you a ticket for not voting. So it's more signaling than anything. Okay. Section 2 goes into the first topology, right, of electoral systems, and we have majoritarian systems. So we have a lot of these. You have single member district plurality, which is like the United States and England. You have the AV, the alternative vote. You have the board account, which we talked about earlier in the book. You have two round systems, which is like the French system. You have single non transferable vote systems, which we'll talk about. You can have a block or a party block vote. And then there's also what's called a supplementary vote system. So that's a lot. Let's kind of dive in, right? The single member district is the US, the UK, India, Canada. Basically, you get one vote in your one region, and that's it, right? Um, and of course, you have federal level elections, you have state level elections, you have um, you know regional or like house district elections or whatever. But you only get one vote per geographic territory, and so um, again, this is Canada, the U.S., the U.K. A lot of people call this sort of the Westminster system. So you get one candidate per region. There are some cons and benefits to these, right? So this is one of the most important things about this chapter is thinking through like what are the benefits and what are the negatives of these different systems. One of the benefits is this really simple, right? It is very easy to understand. It also allows for pretty high level of accountability, right? There's not a coalition government. There's not 16 people who come from your district who are from different parties with different philosophies. There's one single person in charge of your district, and if they screw up, they can be booted, right? And so it's supposed to increase accountability. Now, one of the problems with this, especially in the United States system, is gerrymandering, right? Guaranteeing that you have a district. And at that point, you become far less accountable. But, you know, I don't think that they had gerrymandering in mind when they wrote this textbook, because this is one of the only countries on the planet that allows that. Okay, single party government rule, right? So again, this increases accountability because you can just say like the Democrats are in charge, or the Republicans are in charge, or Labor is in charge, or the Tories are in charge in England, right? Um, and so if things are going well, great. If things are going bad, we can kick them out, and it increases accountability because citizens know basically who is in charge of the government. And as we learned earlier in the book, that leads to greater government stability as well. It's much more likely to be an extended government rather than sort of a collapsing vote of no confidence constantly kind of government. Okay, what are the cons here? One is it's highly unrepresentative, right? So imagine, the Midland district where you live, or the Odessa district, or my Lubbock district. It's like 70% Republican, right? Um, But there are other districts where it's like 51% Republican and 49% Democrat. Texas is a state that's starting to look like that, right? Where in the last election it was like 51-48 Trump, Biden. Um, and Georgia was remarkably close last time, right? But what does that mean? That means that 49% of the people who voted are not being represented in any sense, right? Um, their political beliefs do not matter because no one is after those votes. And so this can lead to highly unrepresentative outcomes. We also get what's called Duverger's law, where it's almost inevitable that two large parties come out of this, right? Because of the first past the post system or single member district or whatever you want to call it, you almost inevitably get two parties and only two parties. And then it gets to the point where they control the institution so powerfully that they make it even worse, where third parties basically have no voice in the system whatsoever. And so if you look at the United Kingdom and you look at some two party systems that are single member district in South America, and if you look at Canada and if you look at the US, we always see two parties, right? And even India is starting to look like this, where the one exception was if you have like regional ethnicity, but even India is starting to become a dominant two-party system, maybe even a one-party system, with the Banata, Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, whereas the Congress Party, who was in charge for 30 years or something under the Gandhis and Nehru, have sort of lost favor, and so it's an interesting situation to watch in India. Although things did reverse a little bit in the last election. So even though Modi is still the prime minister, um, things didn't go fully his way like he thought they were going to. So they have a coalition government now. Um, some other that's called Duverger's law, right? A single member district almost inevitably leads to a two party system. Um, It also discourages what's called true preference voting for third parties. So, in a lot of countries, say you're a communist, right? You can actually vote for a communist party or sort of a socialist party or a far left party because they don't need 50% of the vote to get a seat. They might need only 10%. And so actually voting for a smaller party is strategic. But in these single member districts, um, imagine, right, like, who's a good example? Ross Perot, or who is the one recently, RFK Jr., which was a bit disastrous. But, um, those guys have no real chance, right? There's sure they can like make some hubbub and like force people to think about things differently, but they're not going to be president and they're not going to be represented in the legislature. It's all but impossible, right? Okay. And then the final like problem with these systems is you can get some serious ethnicity or regional based problems where you have one region in control of the whole political system, and maybe it's ethnic based, and so all of the investment goes into that singular region. This can become really problematic in states like Kenya, Nigeria, and others. Okay, let's move on to the alternative vote. Basically, this is just a ranking. It's single member district, but you rank your preferences. If there's not a majority, right, 50% plus one vote, then what you do is you drop the last place. So, say there were five of us running, the fifth guy is going to be dropped out, or woman is going to be dropped out. And then they'll take all of those votes from person number five or candidate number five, and they'll go to their number two, and they'll add those to the other four, right? And if nobody gets a majority at that point, they'll drop the four candidate and they'll redistribute their votes on number three. And then finally, when somebody hits 50% plus one, a majority, that person takes it, right? So, Australia, some Northeastern American states are implementing something like this, like in Vermont, New Hampshire. Ireland runs a system like this. Um, a really good advantage of this that's, yes, it's single member district, but an advantage of this system over just a flat out vote is that you really have to try and be more inclusive and centrist to try and get people's number two, number three, number four vote in case you don't hit that majority, right? And so it this is why they implemented this in Ireland because of the Protestant Catholic, the Troubles, right? And it helps them to cross these really tense religious lines because they have to be able to try and get Protestant voters or Catholic voters, depending on a broad-based national platform, right? So that's one of the advantages of this system. Um, then you have the board account, which is kind of like the same as above, except instead of like recounting votes, they just like attribute a point system to 1 through 5. So, like, if you get someone's first place vote, that's a point. If you get someone's second place vote, it's say 3/4 of a point. If you get someone's third place vote, it's a half a point, et cetera, right? And they'll just add it up, and whoever gets the biggest sum wins. Okay. There are also two-round systems, right? So these are majoritarian. So in the French election, say there will be three or four or five candidates. The two top vote getters will have a runoff. And then, of course, you're going to get an automatic majority unless there's a lot of like vote for neither. But the runoff round winner takes the election. So this is what happened in France recently, where there was a lot of concern with, and what is her name? Marine Le Pen, very far right advocate. Her father was sort of a Nazist. Um, and so she actually came in second place, I think, in the original round, but then she didn't get the majority vote. And so she lost the last election. But every election, she gets a little closer. Um, Let's see. Oh, if you win an absolute majority in the first round, you win, but that's pretty rare because usually a lot of people throw their hats into the first round. Um, some negatives of this is it's expensive, right? Like running an election, counting up all the votes, and then 1 week to 2 weeks later, which is usually how they do this, having yet another election is really expensive. It is not easy to run these things across an entire nation, especially in really rural regions. God, there was a lot to get out. Really rural regions. um, so yeah, it's really expensive. You also get like a significant dropout in the second round where people's favorite candidate is out, and so they just decide not to show up. And so it's not the second round isn't always great, and it almost always has lower voter turnout than the first round. Okay, section three: majoritarian electoral systems in multi-member districts. Okay. So you can also have majoritarian systems in a multi-member district where two, three, four, whatever come out. Voters tend to only get a single vote, but there are multiple members who come from the district, say four of them. These are pretty rare, admittedly, which we'll see later in the book. But they do have good benefits. They're far more proportional than the first past the post systems. And you also generally have more smaller parties and minorities represented in these systems, even if there aren't rules about guaranteeing women and minorities seats, that you still tend to get better outcomes. Some of the cons is that it can cause sort of intra-party fighting, right? And celebrity politicians. So, even though you're on the list, say six people come out of my district in Lubbock, and we pretty much guarantee that four of them are going to be Republicans. Well, there's going to be 10 Republicans in the fight, and they're all going to be ripping each other's throats out to be the one at the top, right? And so you get a lot of really tense party problems. And you also tend to get these celebrity names, people who know nothing about governing or etc. And so that was one of the problems with Japan's system for a while, is that they would have all these like baseball players and people like this, singers who were their legislators, and they didn't really know how to run government, and things got really bad in the 80s and 90s. Okay. We talked about that. Let's see. You also tend to get higher levels of corruption and bribery, right? Because I mean, you basically have an incentive to go and just buy votes in your district because there's a pretty small threshold to actually get into the House or the legislature. And so it encourages a little bit more of that sort of corruption and bribery. And so we see that in Japan and especially in Afghanistan when the U.S. was helping to run a democracy there. Uh, and then, like I said, you get these sort of name recognition incumbents with celebrity and stuff. Let's see. Section 3B is about the block vote and the party block vote. So basically, the block vote says you get, okay, say there's 5 candidates in our district, or even 100. You get 5 or 100 votes, right? Um, and so you can vote as many times as you want, up to 5 times if you like all of them, or as few as one, right? Um, and so if you like 2 candidates, you can vote for both. You can't stack them in most cases, like you can't vote 5 times for one person, but you can vote for more than one person. And then there's what's called the party block vote, and this is the same idea, but you're voting for a list. You're voting for an actual party, right? And what happens in most countries is they'll say, okay, there's 5 people that could come out of this district. We're going to put up our top 5 candidates, right, against your top 5 and their top 5, blah, blah, blah. And then say I win 60% of the votes, I'll get 3 of the 5. This party will get 1. This party will get 1. And so the top 3 people on my list, 1, 2, 3, get taken to the legislature, and number 4 and 5 get dropped. Okay. And then number 1 and number 1 would go from the other parties, right? Okay. Um, Okay, we should also, of course, talk about proportional systems, right? So this is completely different from the United States. Um, they use quotas, and we're not going to get into all of the ways that they translate votes into seats, like the don't and the Basel and all of these different like conversion methods. Don't study any of that. It's not really necessary, right? You just need to know that sort of it's a proportional system. There's not just one person coming out of the district. What happens is you get 15% of the seats or whatever. Um, so you can have multi-member districts. Inevitably, you will have multi-member districts. They are much more proportional than majoritarian systems. They tend to be much more inclusive of smaller parties and minorities. You should get more sincere preferences than you do in a two-party system and a lot less strategic voting. And we also know that these systems get much higher turnout than single member district systems, regardless of whether turnout is compulsory, etc. If you're in a PR system, you are much more likely to vote. You feel much more political efficacy, is what it's called. Like your vote matters, you're doing something in the system, right? There are some cons here. One is this could exacerbate ethnic tensions. We have seen this. If you're not very careful about how you set this up, um, especially when ethnicities are regional based, like in Sri Lanka, like in Nigeria, like in Kenya, like in India, even though they don't have a PR system. Yeah, it can be problematic. You also get almost inevitably coalition governments, right? And this can reduce accountability. You don't really know which party to blame. You have 3 different parties out of 7 making up the government. Um, and you have a whole bunch of people from your district who are supposedly representing you. Who the hell do you go to? Who do you hold accountable? Sometimes that's very difficult. They are more unstable. As we talked about earlier, they tend to collapse a lot more often because of the vote of no confidence. Another problem is that you get extremist parties, right? Like because you only have to hit what's say a 3% threshold, right? And you only need say 10% of the vote to actually get a seat. You start to see some really extreme candidates, and on both sides, whether it's like the anarchists and the super communists on the left, or sort of the Nazis and the far right conspiracists. We're seeing the rise of both in Europe, especially the far right in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, Geert Wilders, excuse me, I got that backward. In Germany with what's called the AfD, the sort of German Alternative Party. You've got Marine Le Pen getting closer and closer in France, and as I mentioned earlier, her dad's a Nazi. She's kind of walked a little bit away from some of that stuff to make herself more palatable, but who knows what her real beliefs are. So yeah, it can be problematic that these people can get into office, right? Okay. You also have list PR systems, kind of just like we talked about earlier, and they'll just take the top ones. Um, we talked about district magnitude earlier, so we have extremes of like the Netherlands and Slovakia and Israel, where you have 150 or 120 legislators all coming from the nation at large. It can be really confusing to understand, like, who the hell should I vote for? There's 150 candidates. Like, who am I supposed to vote for? So yeah, it can become really messy. And then you have like Chile on the opposite side. They have 60 districts of 2 members each, right? So really interesting system. You also have what's called electoral thresholds. So this is one thing that they have across Europe to make sure that sort of Nazist parties don't rise, or like extreme anarchist parties where you'll have to have, say, a 3 to 5 to 10% minimum percentage of the electorate to qualify. So say your, I don't know, anarchist party gets 3.8% of the vote in Germany. Well, you still didn't cross the 5% threshold, so you do not get seats, and we'll redistribute those seats against those who did pass the threshold. Okay. Let's see. There's different types of party lists. So there's closed party lists. Basically, the party determines the order of the candidates, and a lot of times they don't even print the names of the candidates. They just put the party up, and then if we win 30% of the seats, which comes out to say 10, I'll pick my favorite 10 party members to be legislators. But the voters don't actually really get any idea of who the legislators are going to be. You have open party lists where you can choose an individual candidate on a party list. So you can vote for either the party or you can vote for an individual, and they'll sort of run mathematics to determine who wins. Let's see. We have single transferable votes where they'll kind of like we talked about earlier, where you'll list your favorite candidates from like 1 to 5. Um, and they'll get a points, or they'll drop the last, or however they do it. Um, but you get to rank their candidates, which is pretty cool, and it leads to some more centrism, like I said, where you aren't necessarily an extremist just pandering to your base. Like, you want to get even those centrist and other voters. And then some northeastern states in the United States are starting to implement this, so it's pretty cool. We don't have a lot of data yet on whether it's working or not, but I'd say in the next 10 to 15 years we'll start to really understand the differences. Finally, you have mixed systems. So Germany is a good example, where they'll use, say, a single member district system for their upper house, and a plurality system for their lower house, or a proportional system for their lower house. Or some of them even do sort of a mix of both, where, like, if you get 50% or more, you win the district, and then they'll have calculations about proportionality at the bottom. Don't worry about too much about the math. Okay, I would point out figure 13.6, which is really interesting. We've got 177 different countries in 2004, and you can see here sort of what different systems they're using. And so the vast majority, not the majority, but the plurality, right, 65 nations used sort of list PR systems, where you get a proportional representation, and then they'll come off of this list, whether it's open or closed. And then number 2 in here is single member districts, right? So we see a lot of this in North America, in England, of course, in Ireland, but also a lot of South American nations. But then if you look at the actual population per million, right, the vast majority of people who live in democracies actually live in a single member district state. So while proportional states actually outnumber these single member district states, There are a lot more people living in these. And one of the ideas here is that maybe as your population gets farther and farther and farther bigger, basically, that elections just become too expensive and too technically difficult, and that single member districts just become much simpler to manage and understand for your population. So, I don't know how much data there is for that, but it is an interesting argument. I would also point out that dictators tend to use single member districts. They do not use plurality because plurality can get messy. They use single member district systems because they're far easier to rig. They're far easier to pull people off of the candidate lists, things like that. Um, Most European states, I would also point out, were actually single member district, even though the vast majority are now proportional representation. And there's an interesting argument that sort of as the suffrage expanded across Europe to include, regular citizens, women, things like this, minorities, etc., communists started making huge inroads in many of these countries. And so, to ensure that the communists didn't take over in these single member district systems, they guaranteed themselves seats by turning them into PR systems. So, really interesting argument, right? Okay, that's it for the day. I'll get the next one up soon. Thanks for being here and have a great day.